And welcome to our special coverage of this Medal of Honor ceremony today in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much for being here with us on all of our streams, all of our platforms. So today in Washington, D.C., there's going to be a Medal of Honor ceremony at the White House for two Civil War soldiers, Philip Shadrach and George Wilson. And it's been 162 years in the making to make this day happen. And we're going to get into all kinds of stuff today, some of the history behind it, answer some questions you may have, and do all that stuff. But I really first started digging into this story, properly, I guess, last spring. I think we aired the first piece in March of 23, and I talked to a historian named Brad Quinlan, and he knows a lot about this story and was a big part of making all this happen as far as doing research and helping the families, specifically one family member, Ron Shadrach, really kind of navigate a lot of this process. Because to be honest with you, if you are a service member and you've served in the past and you want to try to upgrade, any kind of decoration, Medal of Honor or whatever, there's not really a blueprint for that. And so it takes a lot of people to try to figure out how to navigate all of it and who to contact and what to do. And it really starts with the Army. You start there. They have a board of awards, more or less, and they start that process. And so it's really been an interesting ride to see, to talk to family members and to talk to people involved in this and talk to veterans and people with the Charles H. Coolidge National Medal of Honor Heritage Center, and a lot of these folks who have really done a lot of work on this entire project. So the event, the ceremony is going to start at 4:45 is what we're told. 4:45. So we have a few minutes to kind of set the stage and do some of the things that we talked about, show you some stories on all that. Now, you may have heard earlier in the week, because earlier in the week we got the word that's going to be 5:15, and then the last 24 hours or so started hearing at 4:45. So 4:45 today. So if you heard 5:15, it's 4:45, and so we're going to try to watch that. It's the White House, right? No telling, if they're going to be exactly on time. They're going to be late today. Obviously, we have a newscast at 5 o'clock, so we're up against a hard deadline as well. And if that's the case, we have plenty of videos to show you, to kind of get you to that ceremony if for whatever reason they're running late. But we'll keep watching on that. We're still 6 minutes before their feed even goes live, so we're still watching that right now. But the first thing I want to show you is a story that we aired last night. And this is part of an interview I did with a woman named Jennifer Sweet. And she is a descendant of the Philip Shadrach family. And she has some really interesting perspective on kind of the process. And on top of that, a big piece of this you have to think about, right? 162 years. It's a long time. It's a lot of generations who have come and gone, who knew this story and aren't here today to be a part of this day. And so she talked a little bit about that. And I talked to her, I believe it was February, and you'll notice from the video here, it's a Sunday morning, and I'm wearing a baseball cap and a hoodie, and it's in the winter and it's cold out, and because that's when she was free to do it. And so I went in my basement and recorded this interview, and she was really told me some things I didn't know for sure about this whole story. So let's take a look at this story right now with Jennifer Sweet, a Philip Shadrach descendant. Whole process, I think, for you guys and everybody involved has been getting your hopes up and being let down and getting your hopes up and being let down. So can you just kind of describe and explain kind of that period?
Yeah. So, after I did the research in the 90s and I had all this interest, and I think even I have a letter from the governor of Ohio saying, as soon as I get it confirmed, to let them know because they want to honor him, and that was probably 96, 97. And ever since then, in the early 2000s, I had reached out, had heard something, they were going to get it taken care of. But yeah, I just kind of lost faith that anyone would do anything, because the whole narrative is that it's not his real name. He used a fake name, so there's no way to prove who he says he is and that you're related to him. And to me, it's like, I don't care about getting the medal for myself. It's about getting it for him so that he's honored for his sacrifice.
Many members of the Shadrach family have been told through the years that one factor in how long it's taken to get Shadrach awarded the Medal of Honor is confusion and issues over his name. At times you can find his name as Philip. Other times you can find Perry. It appears he went by both of those names, but he enlisted as Charles Shadrach. In recent years, another Shadrach family descendant told me he learned from government officials that his name really was not a factor. That would also not explain why this process has taken so long for the family of George Wilson. Also, the 2008 National Defense Authorization Act, signed into law by President George W. Bush, approved a request by Congress to have Shadrach and Wilson awarded the Medal of Honor, but it's taken until now to make that happen.
It's just sad that since Bush approved it back in 2008, the generation before me is gone. My dad and his brother that talked about what he did for his country. Dad passed in 2016, and Uncle Bill, the one who fought in World War II, passed away at the age of 95 in 2019. So 11 years, something could have been done. Yeah, I just don't have any faith in bureaucracy. I have absolutely no faith that they'll take care of it.
Man, I know that's disappointing to know how many generations your family have known this story and have known that he wasn't honored. That I can understand why that's difficult.
Yeah. Yeah.
And finally, let me fix this focus here for a second. And finally, after all those years, today is the day that finally all that is going to happen. And I'm sure you guys, who followed this may have questions and comments and thoughts about this. And if you put them on Facebook, we'll try to answer them. But let's go through this a little bit. And the big question you get often, right? Why weren't these two men awarded? Why is it taken so long? These kind of questions here. So let's go through some of the history there. So this is Philip Gebhardt Shadrach. You see Perry here because he went by the name Philip and Perry. Also, when he enlisted as Charles. So that's important in this in a second as well. And this is George Davenport Wilson over here on the right, the black bow tie here, looking dapper there. So the story goes is that it was April of 1862, right? And the forces of General O.M. Mitchell were in Shelbyville, Tennessee, and a traitor, a scout, some call him a spy, James Andrews, shows up there, and he has this plan that he tried before and failed, but he had a plan to go and steal a train and destroy all the railroads between Atlanta and Chattanooga, essentially Marietta and Chattanooga, I guess more specifically. And so the reason to do that was Mitchell's plan was to go where they were going. They were going south through. There's a map on this. Okay, thank you very much. That producer extraordinaire Sam helped me guide this. So that's Shadrach. That's Wilson. Okay, here's the map. This is great. So they started in Shelbyville, Tennessee, and there were 24 to start with, right? And so the plan was to leave there in small groups, twos and threes and fours, and travel down to Chattanooga from Shelbyville. And from Chattanooga, they were going to get on a train, not all together, just whenever they arrived in Chattanooga, and they were going to meet down here in Marietta before the mission. So two men, before they even got to Jasper, Tennessee, right outside of Jasper, Tennessee, they were stopped by the Confederates there. And when they were, the plan was if they were stopped by the Confederates, the story was going to be that they were from Kentucky and they were going to go join the Confederacy down in Georgia. They had friends in Georgia and they wanted to go join those friends and fight there. Well, the first two guys that got stopped, Samuel Llewellyn and a man named Ovid Smith, actually. And so they got stopped with the Confederates and they were like, nope, you have to join us here. We're not going to let you by. They were suspicious, all these things. And so all of a sudden now they're down to 22 men, right? And so the other 22 actually get to Chattanooga, get on trains in Chattanooga, and head toward Marietta. I'm not going to go into every detail of this. So if any historians here to correct me, I'm going to try to skip through this because it's kind of a long story, and it's going to start in about 15 minutes. We don't have a whole lot of time here until we get started here. The feed is about to come up, I do believe. So anyway, they're supposed to meet in Marietta, jump on the train, all this. So 22 get to Marietta, right? So the next morning when they wake up and start to get on the train, only 20 showed up because 2 of the men got there early and they didn't tip the guy that worked at the hotel. So they didn't get a wake-up call. So only 20 make it onto the train, right? So they get on the train to Marietta, the 20 guys. And we go to, and so that's there are in Marietta right here. And you see Big Shanty, why the red line starts in Big Shanty right there. That's where they actually steal the train. It was a breakfast stop. They got off the train, passengers, the conductor, these folks got off the train to eat breakfast. Some folks stayed on the train, but most got off. And so that's when they jumped into action to steal that train. And so they steal a train called the General, unhook the cars with the passengers that were on it, and they take off north toward Chattanooga. And the conductor of the train, sitting there with a big steaming pile of eggs and biscuits and whatnot, sees it and gets up and starts chasing him on foot as the train pulls away. Well, as I told you, Mitchell was going to Huntsville, then to Chattanooga, right? Well, he went to Huntsville and they were able to take Huntsville, but the word was going that they had that he was coming to Chattanooga. So a lot of the people who were in Chattanooga who weren't soldiers and didn't want to fight in that battle and what was going to happen, they got on trains and they left. And so as they're trying to go north, they keep running into trains coming the other direction, going north to south. And so it slows them down and eventually they're captured. Eventually they can see the guy behind him, which is William Fuller. He has a whole thing where he chased him on foot, then he got a hand car, then he eventually in Adairsville gets on a train called the Texas and starts chasing them north, and finally gets right on their heels essentially, and they abandon the train in Ringgold, and then they're all on foot. Over the next few days, they're captured, and they're all jailed. Even the 2 who overslept in Marietta, they're captured down there as well. And so at that point, this is the depiction of them leaving the train there in Ringgold before they're captured. So we'll tell you that story here in a second. Anyway, again.
I think the captures I put in the order, so it should be the one after this.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I'm getting some more direction here. There you go. So this is a depiction here of some of those men being taken out, because after they were captured, they were jailed in Chattanooga. Andrews was court-martialed and he was hanged alone. 7 more were taken to Knoxville, court-martialed. They were hanged in Atlanta as well. And this is some of those, including Shadrach. You see the bottom here, Slavens, Campbell, and Shadrach. They were executed in Atlanta. So 8 were executed, including Andrews. And then after that, they tried to break out of the Fulton County Jail. 8 escaped. 6 didn't. 6 weren't able to get out. So they kept those 6 men. And eventually, those 6 men that stayed in the jail there, they were the ones that were exchanged for prisoners, the Confederate prisoners. And those were the first 6 recipients of the Medal of Honor in our history. And so at that point, we have a shot of that's the picture of them at the hanging there. And so Shadrach and Wilson are both among this 7-man group right here. The 2 that are getting the Medal of Honor today, they're among this group right here. So that kind of tells you kind of the story of generally what would happen. And so the question is why did it take so long? So those 6 men that were in jail and that were exchanged with the Confederate prisoners, they were the first 6 to ever get the Medal of Honor. Over the next 20 years, 19 of those raiders got the Medal of Honor. 1 was offered it and he turned it down. And he was one of those got captured back in Jasper. The guy he was with, he got the Medal of Honor. The 2 who overslept, they got the Medal of Honor. Shadrach and Wilson, who were there for the entire thing and who were hanged, as you just saw in that picture, they never got it. And so originally it was kind of the narrative was, well, the paperwork got lost, right? It was a Civil War. Obviously, record keeping back then is different than it is today. And so that's part of the narrative. And then as the family through the years started looking into it, right, you realize, number one, Shadrach was an orphan. He was never married, so he didn't have any family to really fight on his behalf. Wilson was also divorced, so he didn't have a lot of family either to fight on his behalf. So there's that. So the family starts digging into it more, and they realize, oh, since he enlisted under the name Charles when his name was Philip, that might have caused a problem. So that theory is out there, but really, that's been known for years. And the family yesterday, when they're talking in Washington, D.C., they talk about how they've been writing, just the people who were there have been writing letters to, one of the men wrote a letter to President Carter. So this has been since the 70s. These families have been trying to correct this. And so at any point during this time, this could have been corrected. And for whatever reason, it wasn't. In 2008, as part of the National Defense Authorization Act, when that was passed, there were 5 soldiers that or 5 service members, I guess is the right way to say that Congress wanted to receive the Medal of Honor. 3 of them before now already have, Shadrach and Wilson, since 2008. It's been approved by Congress to go back and re-award them after all these years. And it took until today for this finally to happen. And it took a lot of work through a lot of people and like I said, historians and family members and General B.B. Bell here in town, who was instrumental in helping get Larry Taylor the Medal of Honor. He was very involved in this. And so a lot of people worked very hard just to make all of this happen. And so thanks for changing that there. So the feed at this point is still not all the way up. Can we show them what we have here? Yeah. So this is from the official, this is our Medal of Honor Heritage Center here in Chattanooga. We're going to show you what they've got up right now. If we can show you that. And basically it says that we'll begin shortly. So we're about 7-8 minutes out from that ceremony that we're waiting to see here today. And so you see April 12th, 1862. That's the date of what was called the Great Locomotive Chase, or Andrews Raid. That was the day they stole the train. 6-hour trip north to Georgia. That whole thing. It was 1 year to the day after the Civil War started. The Civil War started on April 12th, 1861, when the first shots were fired on Fort Sumter. And so a year after that was when this event happened. And as we know, the war continued for several more years after that. So we're still watching here. Keep an eye there in Washington, D.C. here today. And so we have some other things to show you here as well that we can get into as well. Let's see if we can go back through some of our pictures here and tell you some more history here. So some of these images were sent out by the Army. Some of these are courtesy of the U.S. Army. This one here is Philip Shadrach. They've taken the old picture and kind of done an update on that. And so this is a picture of George Wilson's grave marker there. So originally, all 8 actually were buried at the old Oakland Cemetery in Atlanta, Georgia. And right after the war, the 7 men who were all hanged together and executed together, they were moved to Chattanooga right after the war. Because you think about it, right? You've got the Confederacy, you've got Atlanta, or you've got Georgia and Tennessee under the Confederacy. But Chattanooga National Cemetery was the second national cemetery ever made, right after the one after Gettysburg, right? And it was made here because of the Battle of Chickamauga and the battles at Lookout Mountain and Missionary Ridge. And you had a lot of soldiers who died and all that. So they needed a place to bury those soldiers because there were a lot of people who died in those battles. And so it's the second one ever made. So after the war, that is officially U.S. government property. And they wanted those soldiers here. And so they moved those 7 here. It took them years to get Andrews's remains here. Now there's a lot of story around Andrew's remains because it took another 20 years to get his remains moved here. And there's speculation that they weren't even sure where they buried him. So there's a lot of things written over time, and who knows the whole story here, right? But that what they actually moved here to Chattanooga, is that really Andrew's remains? Who knows? Who knows? But 8 of them are buried here. The 8 that were all executed there in Atlanta. I showed you this picture earlier, and I said we'd come back to this. So this picture here, this is around, I believe, 1908. These are the Andrews Raiders. 45 years, some odd after the event. This man here in the middle, this bigger man here holding the hat, that man's Jacob Parrott. He is the first recipient of the Medal of Honor. So on the day that all the first six that were awarded ever in our history, he's officially the first recipient of the Medal of Honor right there. And so these are other men who were there, who they had a reunion years later. Now, Parrott's story is fascinating as well. So when they caught him pretty quickly after they jumped the train, and he was beaten pretty severely. He had major injuries from all that. Oh, we're starting. So let me stop talking and pull this up here. All right, we're going to join this in progress. I'm going to go full screen here, and we're going to let this continue so you can watch the entire ceremony without me talking about it, and so you can enjoy this there for yourself.
Please bow with me as we mark this occasion in the invocation. Almighty God, we thank you for your presence with us today as we gather to bestow our nation's honor on these valiant souls whose bold and heroic actions remind us of the price.
The live locator is on.
Here now.
The live locator. That's her name.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, we are having some audio difficulties with this stream. Give us just a second and we are working on it and we will try to get that to you now.
We're the only nation all men. The Virgin Treaty is lives. We haven't always lived up to that. Like George Philip, we never walked away from him. The heroic deeds gone unacknowledged for over a century. Times is not a
Amazon.
Yeah, give me a second.
They want to place this
Josh is gonna try to track.
unity.
The Medal of Honor to Private Philip G. Shadrach and Private George D. Wilson, United States Army, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of their life above and beyond the call of duty. Private Philip G. Shadrach and Private George D. Wilson distinguished themselves by acts of gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty while serving with the 2nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry in Georgia on 12 April 1862. Private Shadrach and Private Wilson were 2 of 22 Andrews Raiders who, by direction of Major General Ormsby M. Mitchell, penetrated nearly 200 miles south into enemy territory. Upon capturing a railroad train at Big Shanty in Georgia, the group set out to complete their mission of disrupting enemy supply lines by destroying bridges and tracks between Chattanooga and Atlanta. Private Shadrach and Private Wilson's gallant actions in close contact with the enemy were in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon themselves, the Army of the Ohio, and the United States Army.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me for the benediction. Heavenly Father, as we depart this ceremony, may the courage of these 2 young heroes be our example. May righteousness be our choice, and may hope be our guiding light as we move with purpose in our world. Grant us grace, O Lord, to meet all the challenges that will come our way, and impart unto us wisdom and the will to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly before you all the days of our lives. In your most holy name we pray. Amen.
Distinguished guests, please remain in place as the President departs. Thank you.
Hey, keep your phone down. Okay, good. You go down. Mr. President, Mr. President.
Please be seated. Thank you. It's a long time in coming. 1 year into the Civil War to abolish slavery, fighting raged across the states. The fate of the nation hung on the balance. President Abraham Lincoln created an award to honor ordinary Americans who showed extraordinary courage in the battle to save the Union. The award was a star-shaped medal made of copper and coated in bronze. At first, it was called the Army Medal of Honor. In time, to capture the full capacity of our armed forces, it became today is our nation's highest military honor. Secretary Austin, Secretary McDonough, Secretary Wormuth, Chairman Brown, General Milley, previous Medal of Honor recipients are here, distinguished guests. The very first recipients of the Medal of Honor were a small band known as Andrews Raiders, named for a spy for the Union Army, James Andrews, who led one of the most daring operations in the entire Civil War. Every soldier who joined that mission was awarded the Medal of Honor, except for two soldiers who died because of that operation, but never received this recognition. Today, we right that wrong. Today, they finally received the recognition they deserve. Private George Wilson, born in Belmont County, Ohio. In his early 30s, not long after the Civil War began, he enlisted in the Union Army. He joined the 2nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry Regiment. He was a father, mechanic, and he was a hell of a debater. He always was ready to persuade, argue, and as one family member put it, dress anyone down if the need be. Private Philip Shadrach, born in Somerset County, Pennsylvania. By the time he was a teenager, Philip was an orphan, a laborer, did everything he could to get by. From what we know, he was a free spirit, always searching for adventure, excitement, intrigue. In his early 20s, Philip enlisted, joining the Ohio regiment that George did, the same one. With us today are members of those families. Teresa Chandler, George's great-great-granddaughter, Gerald Taylor, Philip's great-grandnephew. They shared with us how the stories of their brave ancestors were passed down to families for generation after generation. For Philip and George and their brothers in arms, serving our country meant serving our country, fighting and even dying to preserve the Union and the sacred values it was founded upon: freedom, justice, fairness, unity. George and Philip were willing to shed their blood to make these ideals real. Folks, it was April 7th, 1862. James Andrews, the Union spy, who regularly sneaked behind Confederate lines, was preparing to lead a daring scheme. A group of 24 soldiers, including George and Philip, would travel 200 miles deep into the Confederate territory and steal a Confederate train near Atlanta and drive it north to Chattanooga, just over the Georgia border, which Union troops were preparing to capture, that is Chattanooga. Along the train journey, they would destroy enemy bridges, railroad tracks, telegraph lines, disrupting communications and vital supply lines, sabotaging the railroad that the Confederate Army used to move troops. All of that would make the Union capture Chattanooga much more likely. And that would cut off the Confederate Army from both Ohio and Mississippi River valleys. A huge strategic victory could bring the war to a swift end. The risk of this mission and the risk of all this mission were enormous. If caught, they would certainly be killed. Philip, George, all the men were given a chance to walk away. Not one of them did. Not one of them walked away. Instead, they changed into civilian clothes, got a few hours sleep, and set out for Georgia. Several days later, nearly all of them, including George and Philip, made it to the rendezvous point, a train station just north of Atlanta. They gathered at midnight and waited until morning, when the conductor and passengers disembarked for breakfast. That's when they made their move. Quickly and quietly, they detached 3 boxcars and a locomotive, hopped in, began moving at full speed north to Tennessee. Almost immediately, their problems were increased. Rain made it nearly impossible to burn the tracks and the bridges along the way. There were other trains on the track that were not supposed to have been there, slowing them down considerably. By then, Confederate forces were in hot pursuit, but George and Philip almost made it to Georgia, but about 15 miles from Chattanooga, they ran out of fuel, and the Confederates closed in. The raiders took off on foot, running and hiding in the woods. They survived there for weeks, but one by one, Confederate soldiers, supporters, and their bloodhounds rounded them up. They were taken to a Confederate prison, held in a tiny underground room, chained by their necks and their wrists, starved. Still, the men remained unbowed and unbroken. Eventually, 8 escaped. 6 were exchanged for Confederate prisoners. The rest, including Philip and George, were tried as spies, and both sentenced to death. And that fateful day came. As they approached the gallows, Philip and George stood tall. A crowd gathered around them. Private Wilson turned to face the crowd, summoned the ultimate measure of grace. And according to reports from that day, this is what he said. Looked at the crowd and he said, he believed they were wrong, but he did not harbor hostility toward the people of the South. He said it was not them, but their leaders who were responsible for the rebellion. And he said the time would come when the Union would be restored and the American flag would wave over the entire nation once again. Ladies and gentlemen, till the very end, George and Philip believed in the United States of America, the only nation on earth founded on an idea. Every other nation in the history of the world is based on geography, ethnicity, religion, or some other attribute. But we're the only nation founded on an idea. That idea is that all men are created equal, deserve to be treated equally throughout their lives. We haven't always lived up to that, but like George and Philip, we've never walked away from it either. The heroic deeds went unacknowledged for over a century, but time did not erase their valor. And they want to fight for what they fought for, and they died just as precious today as it was then. Unity over disunion, freedom over subjugation, progress over retreat, truth over lies. Let me end with this. Tomorrow is the 4th of July. Another reminder of why it's so important to know our history, not to erase our history, to remember the sacred cause of American democracy, and not make up a lost cause to justify evil of slavery. To remember the nation that George and Philip fought for and died for, the United States of America. That's who we are. That's who we are. The United States of America, there's nothing beyond our capacity in the United States if we work together. So God bless you all. May God protect our troops. With that, it's my honor to ask the military to read the citations. Thank you.
Gerald Taylor, accepting on behalf of his great-great-uncle, Private Philip Shadrach, and Teresa Chandler, accepting on behalf of her great-great-grandfather, Private George Wilson. Attention to orders. The President of the United States of America, authorized by Act of Congress, March 3rd, 1863, has posthumously awarded in the name of Congress the Medal of Honor to Private Philip G. Shadrach and Private George D. Wilson, United States Army, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of their life above and beyond the call of duty. Private Philip G. Shadrach and Private George D. Wilson distinguished themselves by acts of gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty while serving with the 2nd Ohio Volunteer Infantry in Georgia on 12 April 1862. Private Shadrach and Private Wilson were 2 of 22 Andrews Raiders who, by direction of Major General Ormsby M. Mitchell, penetrated nearly 200 miles south into enemy territory. Upon capturing a railroad train at Big Shanty in Georgia, the group set out to complete their mission of disrupting enemy supply lines by destroying bridges and tracks between Chattanooga and Atlanta. Private Shadrach and Private Wilson's gallant actions in close contact with the enemy were in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon themselves, the Army of the Ohio, and the United States Army.
All right, everyone, as you just saw there, President Biden awarding awarding the Medal of Honor posthumously to Philip Shadrach and George Wilson. I want to apologize again for the technical issues we were experiencing earlier, not being able to provide the audio to you guys. Before we go, we wanted to share with you a podcast episode that Josh Rowe did about this. If you don't know, let me pull this up for you guys. Screen share this for you. So if you all aren't aware, Josh Rowe does a weekly podcast episode on Tomorrowtown, Tennessee. You can listen to him on all these broadcasting platforms right here. And his most recent episode was about Andrews Raiders and about these men who were honored with the Medal of Honor Award. And so I'm going to pull it up for you guys and play it. And once it's done, this stream will be over. We hope you enjoy. And let me get this clip for you guys.
Some plans just don't work out, and we know actions have consequences. And this was war. Now 7 men stood with their boots planted firmly in this Atlanta, Georgia dirt on these final moments of their short lives.
Philip Gebhard Shadrach was a very religious man.
One of his comrades described him like this:
almost being obnoxious. When he was being taken out to be hung, he turned to the group and he said, "I'm not yet ready to meet my Jesus."
On June 18, 1862, Shadrach and the 6 others were hanged near the old Oakland Cemetery in Atlanta. 4 of the men who were executed that day hold a distinction that puts them among the most courageous and valorous to ever wear the uniform of the United States military. In every historical account of this mission, Philip Shadrach was right there with those other men at each step. But when it came to handing out the combat decorations, Shadrach was left out. And even in recent years, the White House has been close on multiple occasions to correcting this record and honoring this war hero. But to this point, nothing has happened.
I don't know if it was my first letter. I might have been a little disturbed, or if it was the last one when finally my patience ran out. But I think I essentially said something almost to the effect of, "What the hell happened?"
My name is Josh Rowe, and this is Tomorrowtown, Tennessee. This story begins like all the great Civil War stories. A few months ago, I got a voicemail from a retired geologist near Cleveland, Ohio.
Hi, Josh. This is Ron Shadrach.
A voicemail and a familiar last name. Ron Shadrach is not a historian, at least not professionally, but he has a small mountain of research. Old letters, excerpts from books, pension records, newspaper stories, a deposition from 1863, all about one specific moment in history. I poured through every page of Ron's paperwork mountain, and the story contained in those documents is a fascinating ride.
Thanks for doing this. I really appreciate you.
Oh, thank you.
We met over Zoom a few days after he left that voicemail, and he told me all about one of his ancestors, Philip G. Shadrach.
He had 2 brothers and 2 sisters.
Philip and his family lived in western Pennsylvania.
He was 3 years old when it appears his mom died giving birth to his youngest sister, Elizabeth.
About 10 years before Ron started digging, a distant relative he never met was doing her own research.
The father couldn't take care of all the kids.
They were all orphans.
This is my grandma's great uncle. And she passed when my dad was only 19 years old. So a lot of the stories that we know have been passed down and passed down.
Jennifer Sweet lives near Akron, Ohio, about 45 minutes from Cleveland.
I'm the closest living relative, basically. It's just really weird to think about.
Jennifer and Ron both know this story well, but they didn't know each other until late last year.
It appears about 1860 or 61, he came to Ohio.
1861. That's the year Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, the official start of the American Civil War. 1861, also the year Philip Shadrach volunteered to defend the Union against the Great Rebellion. His life would end the following year, but not before doing a heroic thing in service to his country.
It's just been interesting things we've found and mysteries, and we're wondering, what does it mean?
Philip Shadrach was one of the legendary Andrews Raiders, the raid that happened 1 year to the day after those shots were fired at Fort Sumter. The raid, often called the Great Locomotive Chase. Andrews Raiders were our country's first recipients of the Medal of Honor. 19 of those men were awarded the medal. 4 of those recipients were executed along with Shadrach, and those 4 were among the last to be awarded. Shadrach was one of 2 of those soldiers who was never awarded the Medal of Honor. All that research that Ron's been working on for years has been an effort to, after all these years, get the Medal of Honor for those 2 soldiers. And as I mentioned earlier, there have been occasions over the past few decades where some believed this was about to happen, but it never did. And even now, in April 2024, the paperwork is in the military office at the White House, waiting for final approval by the president. So for now, Jennifer Sweet, Ron Shadrach, and many others who are part of this story wait and work. And they've spent years waiting and working. Ron says the first several years he worked on this, he kept hitting obstacles and roadblocks.
We then, lo and behold, find out about this 150th anniversary in Kennesaw.
This happened back in 2012.
And we're invited to that.
So Ron goes, and he and his brother visit the Marietta Museum of History, Marietta, about 20 miles north of Atlanta. There, they hear a man telling the story of Andrews Raiders.
What went down and how they, what they had to do to pull this off. And we looked at each other and we thought, this is the guy who can help us.
Help them figure out what to do to get the Army, the Pentagon, the president to take another look at the Philip Shadrach story.
So we said something.
Finally, someone who can help.
He kindly shook his head no.
They thought they were in luck. Then, out of luck. And then...
I know this guy, Brad Quinlan.
Back in luck.
He's the one you want to talk to.
I was hooked on the Great Locomotive Chase real early in my research.
That voice, that's Brad. You also heard his voice at the very beginning of this episode. Brad Quinlan, historian, writes books.
How many books have you written?
Written and co-written 24.
That's a lot of books.
Yeah.
When did you start that?
84.
That guy that Ron Shadrach met at the museum knew what he was doing. Brad Quinlan is the kind of person who just might own boxes and boxes of old Civil War letters.
I have collected copies of over 23,000 Civil War letters.
See?
The Great Locomotive Chase is the reason that we have the Army Medal of Honor.
Brad is in his 60s, big energy, awesome mustache. He's been a volunteer at the Civil War battlefield in Chickamauga, Georgia for about 30 years. And just so we all understand Brad a bit better.
I've gotten to sleep on almost every part of the battlefield, so that's been fun.
So Brad was at the 150th anniversary of the chase, signing copies of a book he wrote.
Duty well performed. The story of the 21st Ohio.
The soldiers in Andrews Raiders were from 3 regiments of the Ohio Volunteer Infantry, including the 21st Ohio. Brad was signing the book when a man he didn't know walked up.
He said, Brad, I'm Ron Shadrach, and my mouth opened. And before I could say anything, yes, I am related to Philip Gebhard Shadrach.
Ron just found the guy he was looking for.
And he looked at me and he said, I've been trying to get the medal for Shadrach and Wilson for 4 years now. I've heard about you. Will you help me get these medals?
So Brad went to work.
Oh, thousands of hours.
Ron's mountain of documents is also Brad's mountain of documents. Ron and Brad worked on all of this together.
Kind of kicked off this collaboration, him down there and me up here.
I sat down with Brad about a year ago in a big conference room. He opens his bags, pulls out a laptop. He shows me books.
And that's an original.
Pictures, papers.
What is that?
This is under oath documentation, 72 pages long, of 5 members of Andrew's raid testifying on exactly what happened moment by moment.
They put together a packet of well over 300 pages, making the case of why Philip Shadrach should be awarded the Medal of Honor. And they submitted the packet to the Army, requesting they take another look at the case of the great locomotive chase.
Pittenger testifies, yes, George D. Wilson, Company B, 2nd Ohio Infantry.
So first of all, William Pittenger is one of Andrew's raiders. He's a big reason we know so much about the raid. He wrote several books about the raiders, giving a first-hand account of what happened. And I mentioned earlier, there were 2 soldiers who were overlooked for the Medal of Honor. There was Shadrach and there was George Davenport Wilson. Here's Brad again, where we left off. Pittenger testified, Wilson and
Shadrach, Company K, 2nd Ohio Infantry. I got under oath testimony that these men were hung and participated in the raid.
In Pittenger's book, Daring and Suffering, he said George Wilson was, quote, the most remarkable man of the whole party. He was not educated highly, though he had read a great deal. But in natural shrewdness, I rarely, if ever, saw his equal.
Let's just start at the beginning. Tell me what point in your life you started hearing stories of George Davenport Wilson?
I was pretty young. I was about 6 years old, 6 to 8 years old.
Ron and Brad's research has led them to many discoveries over the years. Along the way, they also found a few people named Wilson. This is Ashley Wilson.
We found out that he was my 4th great uncle.
Ashley told me her father and sister discovered a family connection to George Wilson by researching their family genealogy.
So I remember once we found him and once we found his story and put the family lineage together, my father was full of pride about George and who he was and what he did for our nation and the sacrifices that he had made. So from that point, about 8 years old, I grew up with stories of the Great Locomotive Chase and the Andrews Raiders and the speech that Uncle George had said right before he was hung.
As the 7 raiders stood on the scaffolding just before their execution, George Wilson asked to speak. At this point, the rest of the raiders were being held in a jail in Atlanta. Pittenger wrote that the prison guards told them what Wilson said. I'm going to read what Pittenger wrote in his book, Capturing a Locomotive. He wrote, he told the rebels that they were all in the wrong, that he had no hard feelings towards the Southern people for what they were about to do because they had been duped by their leaders and induced by them to engage in the work of rebellion. He also said that though he had been condemned as a spy, yet he was none, and they well knew it. He was only a soldier in the performance of the work he had been detailed to do. That he did not regret to die for his country, but only regretted the manner of his death. He concluded by assuring them in prophetic words that they would yet live to regret the part they had taken in this rebellion and would see the flag of our country wave in triumph over the very ground occupied by his scaffold. This address made a deep impression on the minds of all who listened, and I often afterwards heard it spoken of in terms of deepest admiration. When he ceased, the signal was given, and the traps fell.
My father died in 2012, and it was something that he had fought for to get to this point because they were never awarded the Medal of Honor.
Wilson and Shadrach were both executed that day, and they were the only 2 soldiers among the raiders who were never awarded or offered the Medal of Honor.
So when my father passed away, it was one of the last things that he left unfinished that he wanted done.
Wilson and Shadrach will forever be linked.
Philip Shadrach, George Davenport Wilson,
Shadrach, Shadrach. I have told this story several times, but nowhere near the number of times Brad has told this story. And that story begins with a meeting between the leader of the group, civilian scout James Andrews, and General O.M. Mitchell, who had set up camp near Shelbyville, Tennessee.
He wanted to attack and take over Chattanooga. It's an important rail line. It's a river.
So the plan.
They would take 22 Union soldiers.
Plus another civilian who happened to be at the camp. So 2 civilians and 22 soldiers total left Shelbyville on the mission.
They would go in small groups of 3 and 4.
Head to Georgia.
Steal a train called the General.
But by the time they got on that train, those 24 men were now down to 20. 2 civilians, 18 soldiers. But the plan, it was still intact. The Raiders were going to race north on the train and rip up the railroad.
And then the Confederates couldn't get reinforcements from Marietta up to Chattanooga.
Then the Union takes Chattanooga and ends the war quickly. Easy. No problem.
Well, everything fell apart very quickly. William Fuller, the conductor of the General, he started chasing the train and screaming, "They're stealing my train, they're stealing my train."
A lot of that falling apart happened near and in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And today, you can find many of the places where some of the worst of the falling apart happened.
The engine ran out of wood and water at Ringgold.
There's still today a marker right next to the railroad where the train still runs today. The marker sits right next to a road on one side. Georgia State Route 151, or Ooltewah-Ringgold Road. The railroad is on the other side of the marker and is surrounded by a few scattered small homes. The marker tells the story of Andrews' Raiders and the great locomotive chase. The pursuit then was at such a rapid pace that serious damage to the railroad by the Raiders was impossible. The General was abandoned by the Raiders on account of lack of fuel and the close pursuit.
They had to abandon the train.
They were just under 20 miles from Chattanooga.
So they actually then were captured over the course of the next weeks.
And that is when this story takes a dark turn for the Raiders.
Taken here in Chattanooga in a prison.
There is another historical marker on Lookout Street in downtown Chattanooga that marks the spot where that jail stood. The Raiders described the jail as a dungeon, handcuffed and chained together by the neck. No windows, so no sunlight. They were crawled over by rats and mice. Terrible situation. Now, during the few weeks the Raiders were in the jail in Chattanooga, James Andrews, the civilian leader, was court-martialed there. The book, Stealing the General by Russell S. Bonds, gives us a specific location of the trial in Civil War-era Chattanooga. It's hard to imagine that scene as you walk through the downtown streets of the city today. So back in 1862, in the corner of 4th and Market in downtown Chattanooga, that was the location of the old National Guard Armory building. In that building is where they held the court-martial for James Andrews. He was tried as a spy and convicted and sentenced to death by hanging, and he was hanged there in Atlanta, Georgia. That spot now where the National Guard Armory used to sit, there's now a Mexican restaurant there. For years, it was an Applebee's. Andrews was taken to Atlanta and was hanged alone.
On June 7th, 1862.
The rest of the jailed Raiders were moved to Atlanta as well. 7 more of them,
including Shadrach and Wilson, were hung on June 18th, 1862.
We heard Brad tell the story of what Shadrach said as they were taking him to the gallows at the beginning of this episode.
When he was being taken out to be hung, he turned to the group and he said, "I'm not yet ready to meet my Jesus."
All 7 of the executed men were buried in a mass grave in Atlanta. Years later, their remains, along with Andrews' remains, were exhumed and moved to Chattanooga National Cemetery. The story of Andrews' Raiders can get confusing. The 24 Raiders left Shelbyville. Well, one pair was stopped near Jasper, Tennessee by Confederates, so they never even got into Georgia. So that leaves 22 men. Another pair never got word on the plan to meet up the morning of the mission, so they were asleep and missed the whole thing. When the Raiders showed up for the mission, there were 20 men, 18 soldiers, 2 civilians. Now, those 20 and the 2 who overslept were eventually captured and held in jails and prisons. Over the next several years, 19 soldiers were awarded the Medal of Honor. So in that 19, that included just 16 of the 18 who were there for the whole mission, plus the 2 who were asleep and missed the mission, and one of the men who never made it into Georgia. The man he was with when they were stopped by the Confederate Army in Tennessee was offered the Medal of Honor, but he declined. Andrews and the other civilian, they were not eligible. So every soldier who left Shelbyville for this mission was either awarded or offered the Medal of Honor, except for Shadrach and Wilson. Here's Ron Shadrach again.
My great aunt, when she showed me the name emblazoned at the state capitol on the bronze plaque.
He went to the Ohio State Capitol when he was a young boy and saw the name Shadrach on a war memorial. Ron's aunt told him this.
That we weren't related. And she didn't want to talk about it.
This is his first memory of anything related to Philip Shadrach, and like any curious child, he kept asking questions, but all he got was...
That was something that happened down south.
So he spent his young life thinking whatever he saw on that monument didn't have anything to do with him. Jennifer Sweet had a completely different experience. She's been hearing this story most of her life.
I was probably only 4 or 5. My dad was a huge history buff.
So about 30 years ago,
it was 93.
Jennifer started digging into her family history to see if she could find someone to help correct all of this. After years of digging and writing letters, she did get a few encouraging responses from elected officials. But in the end, nothing materialized.
I just kind of lost faith that anyone would do anything.
Then, a few years after that, Ron saw a story in his local newspaper.
Backing Private Philip Shadrach and George D. Wilson for the Medal of Honor. And I'm like, wow, is this what it was I saw? And I did some research and I found out this guy had blonde hair and blue eyes, and my dad did, and I do, and his father, and I had him look up in our book, and sure enough, there was this guy in our ancestry book.
That story was about a veteran in Ohio and a former congressman trying to do the same thing Jennifer was trying to do in the 90s, and later what Ron started trying to do as well.
I called that reporter, and I got a lot of pushback, and they weren't, they denied that I existed, and it was like eye-opening.
Ron believes that reporter was told that since Philip Shadrach was an orphan, he didn't have any family members. Tracing genealogy back to someone who died 162 years ago can be complex, but the idea that Philip Gebhard Shadrach's family had no descendants, Ron and Jennifer say that's just not true.
One of Uncle Bill's children has the high chair that Perry built.
Jennifer told me the story has been passed down through the generations in her family. But did you catch the name that she just said?
I've known about Perry since I can remember.
There, Jennifer did not say I've known about Philip.
I've known about Perry since I can remember.
So this has also complicated the process. At times it seems he went by Philip, at other times Perry.
Do you know what name he used when he joined the Army?
Charles P. Shadrach.
The family thought for years the confusion over the different names may have been why he was never honored. But now, Ron says government officials told him that's really not a factor. He says he has spent a lot of time working to clear up confusion with this story, even when talking to congressional staffers.
Well, we've looked at this and we see all the Raiders got the medal. And I'm like, no, you can find that written, but this is why we're writing, because 2 didn't. And they're like, well, it must have been that all that were going to get it had received it and it's taken care of. And it's like, no. And then they had another say, well, Mr. Shadrach, we see that Shadrach was ineligible because he enlisted under an assumed name. Is there anything else we can do for you, sir?
You can understand why this might get frustrating.
It's like, I'm not going to write another letter and try and explain this.
To be awarded the Medal of Honor, the recommendation must be submitted within 3 years of the combat action and must be awarded within 5 years. If more time has passed, then you have to get authorization from Congress. In the 2008 National Defense Authorization Act that was signed into law by President George W. Bush, Congress authorized and requested the Medal of Honor be presented to 5 men. Shadrach and Wilson were named in the legislation. The other 3 heroes have all been awarded the Medal of Honor.
It's just sad that since Bush approved it back in 2008, the generation before me is gone. My dad and his brother that talked about what he did for his country. Dad passed in 2016, and Uncle Bill, the one who fought in World War II, passed away at the age of 95 in 2019. So 11 years, something could have been done. Yeah, I just don't have any faith in bureaucracy. I have absolutely no faith that they'll take care of it.
I know that's disappointing to know how many generations your family have known this story and have known that he wasn't honored. That I can understand why that's difficult.
Yeah. Yeah.
This was also close to happening back in 2016. But according to a document Ron received, the case was forwarded by the Secretary of the Army to the Secretary of Defense to forward to the President for his final decision. That document says the Secretary of Defense sent the case back with no explanation. Again, that was 2016, President Obama's final year in office.
I actually wrote 3 or 4 letters to President Obama. I don't know if it was my first letter. I might have been a little disturbed, or if it was the last one when finally my patience ran out. But I think I essentially said something almost to the effect of, what the hell happened?
There is a thread that connects everyone you've heard from in this story. Ron, Jennifer, Brad, Ashley, her family, even the people behind that newspaper story Ron saw many years ago. All of them heard about Wilson and Shadrach and thought, I'm going to do something about this. And all those people are not alone. There are several people in Chattanooga, Tennessee working now to see that these 2 heroes are honored. The congressman in Tennessee's 3rd District, Chuck Fleischman, told me in September that Shadrach and Wilson will be awarded the Medal of Honor. It's now just a question of when. Also, the people behind the Charles H. Coolidge National Medal of Honor Heritage Center in Chattanooga have been pushing for this. This is spokesperson Vince Butler at an event in January.
We believe their packet has been approved. It is sitting on the president's desk awaiting his signature. We know in 24, sometime this year, the president's supposed to sign that.
And retired 4-star General B.B. Bell has been working on this as well. He said this during his remarks at the funeral for Captain Larry Taylor in early February, speaking about the Medal of Honor recipients who are buried at Chattanooga National Cemetery.
Wilson and Shadrach will join them soon, I'm sure, and I pray.
I can tell from the way you talk about it that it's been hard on you in a lot of ways. It's been stressful in a lot of ways. Can you just explain that? Just kind of like the toll is kind of taken on you, the time you put into it and all those things?
Well, I don't know if it's a toll. It's a full amazing thing, and we're, I think we're very fortunate to be part of it.
Over these years of fighting to make sure Shadrach and Wilson are not forgotten, Ron has learned about family history he never knew. He met family members he never knew existed, and members of George Wilson's family as well. If and when the White House makes an announcement that Philip G. Shadrach and George D. Wilson will be awarded the Medal of Honor, they will all be thrilled by this news. But at the same time, they've lost a lot of Shadrachs and Wilsons over the last 162 years who also would have loved to be here for that moment.
In doing this, we've lost a whole generation. A whole generation of families gone. And, but we have another generation. And I've got 7 grandkids, and so they'll see this, and they're at the age when I first discovered this.
If you would like to learn more about Andrew's Raiders, I've included the resources I used to help me tell this story in the show notes in this episode of Tomorrowtown, Tennessee. This podcast is a production of News Channel 9, Fox Chattanooga, and Sinclair Broadcast Group Chattanooga. I hope you join me again real soon.
All right, everyone. That was Josh Rowe there with his podcast episode on Shadrach and Wilson. We hope you've enjoyed this broadcast. If you enjoyed that podcast episode, we encourage you to look up Tomorrowtown, Tennessee on any of these broadcast platforms right here. Josh works hard on this podcast, and he releases weekly episodes that you guys can tune into. We hope you have a great evening, and good night.